The first snow of the season was already turning the gravel shoulder of Highway 11 into a gray slush when Margaret Ellison realized she was about to spend the worst evening of the year stranded north of Gravenhurst, completely unaware that the man who would stop to help her was the very man she had spent all afternoon dreading to meet. She didn't know that yet. All she knew was that her Range Rover had gone silent halfway between the Muskoka turnoff and the dim string of lights that marked the edge of Bracebridge, and that the dashboard had lit up with a constellation of warnings she had no idea how to read. At 41, Margaret had built a reputation across Bay Street as the woman who could read a balance sheet the way other people read a children's picture book. She ran Northgate Capital out of a glass tower in downtown Toronto, managed a portfolio that touched nearly every mid-sized manufacturer in southern Ontario, and had, just that morning, walked into a boardroom and quietly ended the career of a man who had spent 6 months trying to push her out. None of that was any use to her now. The engine ticked once, twice, and died, and the heated seat beneath her went cold within minutes. She tried her phone, 1 bar, then none. The cell towers up here were a rumor more than a reality, and the snow had thickened into a curtain that swallowed the road in both directions. She pressed her forehead against the cold window and let out a breath she'd been holding since lunch. The blind date had been Diane's idea. Diane, her oldest friend and the only person at Northgate who still spoke to her like a human being instead of a chief executive, had cornered her in the elevator 3 days earlier and refused to let it go. "You are going to drive up to my cabin country. You are going to meet a perfectly nice man at the old mill, and you are going to remember that you are a person, Margaret, not a machine for generating shareholder returns." "I don't have time for this." "You have nothing but time. You just spend all of it alone in a 42nd floor office, pretending that's the same thing as a life." That had stung enough that Margaret had agreed, mostly to make Diane stop. The man's name was Daniel. He was, apparently, a widower with a young daughter. Diane had said the word carpenter with the same care a person might use handling something fragile, as though she expected Margaret to flinch. Margaret hadn't flinched. She'd simply assumed with the easy certainty of someone who had been disappointed many times that the evening would be 2 hours of polite, mismatched small talk before she could plead an early meeting and escape back to the city. Now it seemed she wouldn't even make it that far. 12 kilometers south, Daniel Roy was driving his ancient GMC pickup with the heater cranked and the radio off, rehearsing in his head all the reasons he should turn around and go home. At 36, he had spent the last 4 years learning how to be both parents at once to his daughter, Chloe, who was 6 and missing her 2 front teeth and convinced that her father could fix absolutely anything. Most days, she wasn't wrong. He ran a small restoration workshop out of a converted barn outside Bracebridge, bringing old furniture and older houses back from the dead, and before that he'd spent a decade as a Finnish carpenter and, in another life entirely, 2 years at an engineering firm in Ottawa that he never talked about anymore. He had a worn flannel shirt under his only good jacket, a borrowed truck because his own was up on blocks, and $40 in his wallet because the lumber supplier had wanted cash that morning and he hadn't had the heart to tell them no. His sister, Annick, had set the whole thing up. "She's lovely, Dan. She's smart. She's successful. She works in finance down in Toronto. You'll like her." "Finance," he'd repeated, the way another man might say, "the dentist." "Don't do that. Don't decide you hate her before you've met her. You've been hiding in that barn with Chloe for 4 years and you're going to wake up one day and she'll be grown and you'll be alone and you'll wonder where the time went." He had agreed the way you agree to things when your younger sister is the only family you have left within 500 kilometers. The Old Mill restaurant up by the lake was the kind of place that put a price on the menu that made him do quiet arithmetic, and he'd already decided he would order something small and nurse a single coffee and hope this finance woman wouldn't notice him counting coins like a man at the end of his rope. Which he was, more or less. The bank held a note on the barn and the note was coming due, and $40 was not the answer to anything. He almost didn't see the Range Rover. The snow had erased the line between road and shoulder, and it was only the faint red wink of a hazard light half buried under accumulating white that made him ease off the gas. A dark shape sat tilted at the edge of the highway, no exhaust, no glow from the dash. Whoever was inside had been sitting in the cold long enough that the windows had begun to fog from the inside. He could have kept going. He was already late, already dreading the evening, already turning the heater up against the part of him that knew he'd never forgive himself if he read about a frozen motorist in the paper next week. He pulled the truck onto the shoulder, set his own hazards, and zipped his jacket to the chin. Margaret saw the headlights bloom in her mirror and felt her whole body tense. She had spent enough years being told to be careful, being assigned drivers and security and assistants who hovered, that a stranger pulling over on an empty highway at night registered first as a threat. Her hand found the small canister of pepper spray Diane had pressed on her 2 birthdays ago, the one she'd always thought of as ridiculous. She watched a tall figure climb out of the pickup, hunch against the wind, and walk toward her with the unhurried gait of someone who was cold, but not in any hurry to be anywhere. He knocked twice on the glass, gently. "You all right in there?" His breath fogged white against the window. He didn't look like anyone's idea of danger. He looked tired and good-natured and thoroughly underdressed for the weather, with snow already collecting in his dark hair. Margaret cracked the window 2 inches. Cold air knifed into the cabin. "I'm fine," she said, in the voice she used to end meetings. "My roadside service is on the way." He glanced at the dead dashboard, the dark interior, the phone glowing uselessly in her lap with its little crossed-out signal bars. "Up here? On a night like this? You'll be waiting till spring." He said it without any meanness, almost apologetic. "Pop the hood and let me have a look. I won't charge you for it, and I won't bite." "Excuse me?" She was not in the habit of taking instructions from strangers in the snow. "The hood," he said again, patient. "Newer rovers do this in the cold sometimes. There's a fuel line and an electrical relay that don't get along below -10. Could be 10 minutes. Or you can sit here and freeze in a very nice coat, and that's your business." He almost smiled. "But it seems like a waste of a good coat." Something in the dry kindness of it disarmed her. She told herself she was simply being practical. She was, in fact, freezing, and reached down to release the latch. He lifted the hood and clicked on a small flashlight he produced from his jacket. Margaret watched through the windshield as he leaned into the engine, and there was something in the way he moved that she recognized without being able to name it. The unself-conscious competence of a person doing a thing they had done 1,000 times. She lasted about 90 seconds before the sight of someone else working while she sat useless became unbearable. She pulled her gloves on, found the umbrella in the back seat, and stepped out into the storm. The snow soaked through her shoes immediately. She crossed to the front of the car and held the umbrella over him and the engine, blocking the worst of it. He looked up, surprised. "You didn't have to do that. It's brutal out here." "I don't like watching other people solve my problems," she said, holding it steady. "What's wrong with it?" "Relay, mostly. And a connector that's corroded green." He pointed the flashlight at a small black box wedged near the firewall. "The cold made it give up. Common up here, where nobody's car was designed for a real winter. Give me a minute." He pulled a folding multi-tool and a length of wire from somewhere on his person and began, with careful fingers, to clean and bridge the connection. "You can actually fix it out here?" "Enough to get you moving. You'll want a real shop to do it properly, but this'll hold." He glanced at her, at the cashmere coat, the careful blonde hair now darkening with melt, the heels entirely wrong for a Muskoka snowfall. "Let me guess. You're not from up here." "Toronto." She hesitated, then, surprising herself. "I was on my way to a dinner I have absolutely no desire to attend." He laughed, a low, warm sound that startled out of him and hung in the cold air. "We have something in common, then. I'm driving to the single most dreaded date of my life." She felt an odd little jolt. "A date. Let me guess. She sounds awful." "Haven't met her." He twisted 2 wires together with a neat motion. "My sister set it up. Some finance executive down from the city. Probably spends her weekends restructuring companies and judging people who buy furniture at a big box store." He said it lightly, with no real cruelty in it, just the armor a nervous man puts on. "I run a workshop. I've got a 6-year-old and a mortgage that's eating me alive. I figure I'm in for 2 hours of her checking her watch and being polite about my hands." Margaret was glad, suddenly, that the dark and the snow hid her face, because she felt heat rise into it. "That seems unfair," she said carefully. "Maybe she's just tired. Maybe she spends all day around people who only want something from her, and she'd give a great deal for one conversation where nobody's angling for anything." He paused over the engine and looked at her, really looked, the flashlight throwing a small, warm circle between them. "Maybe," he allowed. "Why would a woman like that want dinner with a guy whose truck is older than she is, though?" Because, Margaret said, and was astonished to hear her own voice go quiet and honest. Sometimes the people who know how to fix things are the only ones worth talking to when everything is falling apart. He held her eyes a beat too long. The wind howled down off the lake and neither of them moved. Then he cleared his throat, looked back down, and snapped the connector closed. All right, try her now. She slid into the driver's seat, turned the key, and the engine caught on the second crank and settled into a steady, grateful idle. Warmth began to seep from the vents almost at once. She nearly laughed with the relief of it. When she stepped back out, she pulled a clean handkerchief from her bag, a small monogrammed thing, an affectation she'd never quite abandoned, and held it out to him. For your hands. He looked at the white linen, then at his own grease-blackened fingers. I'll wreck it. That's what it's for. She pressed it into his palm. Margaret. He wiped his hands and offered the cleaner one. Daniel. Most people call me Dan. His fingers were rough and warm. Drive slow on the bends, Margaret. The plows haven't been through and it's glass under that snow. Good luck with your terrifying finance executive, Dan, she said, and a real smile broke across her face, the first in longer than she cared to admit. Good luck with your dreaded dinner. They pulled apart the old GMC and the dark Range Rover, and the snow folded in behind them, and neither of them understood that the only honest conversation either of them had had in months had just been with the precise person they were both driving north to avoid. The old mill sat on a rise above the frozen edge of the lake, all timber beams and amber light, the kind of restaurant that made Daniel feel the cuffs of his one good jacket the moment he walked in. The host, a young man in a crisp vest, took in the flannel collar and the snow melting off his boots with a flicker of something that wasn't quite a sneer and led him to a corner table by the tall windows. Daniel ordered a coffee, declined the wine list, and checked the cracked screen of his phone. 7:15. Some part of him hoped this Margaret would simply not show, so he could finish his coffee and drive home and make grilled cheese for Chloe and let his sister down gently in the morning. 10 minutes later, the door opened and the room shifted around the woman who came through it. She had dried her hair somehow and changed into something dark and elegant, and she carried herself like a person used to every room arranging itself to her. The host nearly tripped over himself. Daniel watched her approach with the strange disorientation of a dream bleeding into waking, and he was halfway to his feet, coffee cup still in his hand, when she stopped dead 3 steps from the table. Dan, she said. He set the cup down very carefully, the way you set down something you're afraid of dropping. Margaret. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Then Margaret began to laugh. Not the polished laugh she used at galas, but something helpless and real that bent her forward and made the host glance over in alarm. You, she managed. You are the salt of the earth single father my friend has been trying to sell me on for a week. He felt the whole knotted dread of the evening simply dissolve. And you are the terrifying finance executive my sister swore I'd hate. He shook his head. She left out the part where I'd already met you face down in your engine on the side of a highway. She sank into the chair across from him, still laughing, and the host retreated, baffled. Of all the cars, she said, of all the people to stop. I told you, lucky night. I would not have used the word lucky an hour ago. But she was smiling, and so was he, and the wall of the evening had simply come down between one breath and the next. The menus arrived, leather-bound and absurd. Daniel opened his and felt the blood leave his face. A piece of trout at $38, a steak that cost more than his grocery budget for a week, $40 in his wallet. He'd known abstractly, but the numbers on the page made it real, and he felt the old familiar shame begin to climb his throat. Margaret, who had spent 20 years learning to read the small tells of men across negotiating tables, saw the tightening at the corner of his jaw, the way his eyes moved down the right-hand column instead of the left. She understood at once, and she closed her menu before the server could even arrive. Actually, she said smoothly when the young man appeared, we won't be having dinner here tonight. Mr. Roy and I have some business to take care of elsewhere. We'll settle for the table, and thank you. Daniel stared at her. Margaret, I can't stand this place, she said quietly, leaning in once the server had gone. I've been to a dozen dinners like this, and every one of them is the same. Tiny food, enormous prices, and half the room calculating what the other half is worth. I only agreed to meet here because it was neutral ground. Her mouth quirked. Besides, you look like a man doing math, and I've ruined enough men's evenings this week. He let out a breath that was half laugh, half gratitude. I was definitely doing math. Then let's go somewhere I can actually afford to be myself. She stood and held out her hand, and after a moment he took it. They didn't get to the door before trouble found them. A man in an expensive overcoat detached himself from a nearby table and stepped into their path, a glass of red wine cradled in one hand and a smile that had nothing warm in it. Margaret Ellison, out among the common folk. How wonderfully unexpected. Margaret's spine went rigid. Gerald. The temperature of her voice dropped 10 degrees. I'd heard you were licking your wounds in Bermuda. Flew back this morning. Couldn't miss the chance to watch you continue your remarkable streak of poor decisions. Gerald, the same board member she had outmaneuvered and removed that very afternoon, let his gaze travel slowly over Daniel, the flannel collar, the scuffed boots, the workman's hands. And who is this? Surely not a new acquisition, Margaret. He looks rather depreciated. Has Northgate opened a charity wing for the local laborers? Margaret's hand curled into a fist at her side. She opened her mouth, and Daniel touched her elbow, just lightly. It's all right, Margaret, he said, and there was no heat in it at all. He looked Gerald over the way a man looks at a piece of furniture someone's asking too much for, and his eyes settled on the watch glinting at the man's wrist. That's a nice piece, he said pleasantly. Paddock, isn't it? Pity about the case, though. See the way the lugs are wearing on the left side? That happens when a man buys a watch to be seen wearing it instead of to actually keep time. The movement inside is probably fine. It's the man strapping it on who's running a few beats slow. The two investors hovering behind Gerald went very still. Gerald's smile cracked down the middle, color flooding up from his collar. I beg your pardon. I'm just saying, Daniel went on, easy and unhurried, you can put a beautiful finish on a rotten frame, but anybody who works with their hands can tell the difference between something that was built to last and something that was built to impress. The first kind's quiet. The second kind always has to tell you how much it cost. He nodded, almost friendly. Enjoy your evening, Gerald. One of the investors coughed into his fist and looked at the floor. Gerald, robbed of any reply that wouldn't make him look smaller, turned a deeper shade of red, muttered something about charity dinners, and stalked back to his table. Margaret looked at Daniel as though seeing him for the first time. In 2 decades, she had watched powerful people try and fail to land a single clean hit on Gerald Vance, and a carpenter from Bracebridge had done it in 30 seconds without raising his voice. You, she said, a little breathless, are a genuinely dangerous man. I deal with a lot of warped wood, he said. You learn to spot the kind that's rotten all the way through. He glanced around the gilded room and made a face. You were right. This place is terrible. Let's go. The snow had thinned to a soft drift by the time the old GMC pulled into the gravel lot of a diner on the edge of Bracebridge, a low building with a buzzing neon sign that said simply "Eat" and a window fogged orange from the warmth inside. It could not have been further from the old mill. The air smelled of coffee and frying onions and something sweet on the griddle. Margaret stepped out of the truck in her elegant dark dress and her ruined shoes and took a deep breath of it like a woman surfacing from underwater. The man behind the counter looked up. Danny, where you been hiding? The usual? Make it 2, Pete, and extra everything. They slid into a cracked vinyl booth in the corner. When Pete set down 2 enormous burgers and a mountain of fries, Margaret picked hers up in both hands without a flicker of hesitation and took an enormous bite and closed her eyes. Oh, she said around it, reaching for a paper napkin, that is the best thing I have eaten in a year. The old mill could never. Daniel laughed and stole a fry from her plate. Under the flat fluorescent light, with her hair damp and a smear of ketchup near her thumb and the careful executive armor nowhere to be found, she looked entirely unlike the woman who had ended a man's career that morning. She looked younger and funnier and bone-tired in a way money couldn't touch. So, he said, Margaret Ellison, who is she, really, when she's not terrifying men in restaurants? She wiped her mouth and considered the question seriously. She's someone who spends most of her life playing a long game of chess against people she doesn't even like. I took over Northgate from my father. He taught me to be sharp, to build walls, to never let anyone see me bleed. She turned her coffee cup slowly on the formica, and lately the walls just feel like a very expensive sell. I'm so tired of every single thing being a transaction. Why keep doing it then? Because thousands of people's jobs sit on top of my decisions, and that's not nothing. She looked up. What about you? Anik told me you ran a desk at an engineering firm in Ottawa once. You could be making 3 times what a workshop brings in, sitting in a warm office. Why a barn full of broken chairs in the middle of cottage country? He was quiet a moment, turning a fry over in his fingers. My wife got sick when Chloe was a baby, he said finally. By the time it was over, I'd missed almost 2 years of my daughter's life sitting in that warm office, telling myself I was doing it for them. After the funeral, I quit. I came up here, took over my dad's old shop, and I decided I'd rather have less and actually be there. He shrugged, a little embarrassed by his own honesty. My dad used to say you don't throw a thing away just because it's broken. You take the time to understand how it came apart, you find the damaged piece, and you put the work in to bring it back. I want Chloe to grow up believing that. About furniture, about people, about all of it. Margaret reached across the chip table and rested her fingers lightly over his, and the small warmth of it went straight through him. Chloe is lucky, she said softly, to have a father who knows the difference between fixing something and discarding it. They stayed in that booth until Pete started stacking chairs and the neon sign clicked off. They talked about their childhoods and their failures and the small private dreams neither of them ever said out loud. For a few hours, Daniel forgot about the note on the barn, and Margaret forgot the weight of 40 floors pressing down on her, and they were simply 2 exhausted people who had found, on the worst night of the season, an unexpected place to set the weight down. He drove her back to her car, which started on the first try, and followed her tail lights all the way to the highway to make sure she got there safe. At the turnoff, she rolled down her window, snow catching in her hair. "Thank you, Dan," she called, "for the car, for getting me out of that awful room, for the burger, for all of it." "Anytime," he said, "and if the Rover acts up again, you know where the barn is." "I do," she said, "and there was a promise in it. I really do." 3 days later, the world had closed back in. Daniel stood in the cold workshop with a registered letter from the bank in his hands. The final demand, $41,000 in arrears, 2 weeks to find it or lose the barn his father had built board by board. Chloe sat on a stool at his workbench, swinging her feet, gluing a wing onto a model airplane and humming to herself, blissfully unaware that the floor was falling out from under them. He rubbed his eyes and tried to keep his hands from shaking. He hadn't heard from Margaret. He'd told himself it was better that way. People like her didn't end up with men who smelled of varnish and worry. Then he heard tires on the frozen gravel and the low purr of an engine he recognized, and he turned to see the dark Range Rover roll up outside the open barn door. Margaret stepped out, but not the Margaret from the restaurant. This one wore jeans and worn boots and a Heva parka, her hair tied back, and she looked entirely at home, crossing the threshold into the sawdust and the cold. She spotted Chloe first and crouched down to the little girl's level. "That's a magnificent airplane," she said. "Are those the long-range wings?" Chloe beamed, gap-toothed. "Yeah, my dad says if you don't glue the wings on straight, the whole thing crashes." "Your dad," Margaret said, rising and turning to Daniel, "is a very wise man." "Margaret," Daniel said, his throat tight, "what are you doing up here?" She reached into a leather bag and dropped a thick folder onto the workbench, right beside the bank's letter. "I have a serious problem, Dan," she said, and her voice had slid into something brisk and businesslike, though her eyes hadn't. "Northgate owns or holds paper on roughly 24 heritage properties across this province, old mills, century farmhouses, a couple of historic inns. Every one of them is being slowly destroyed by contractors who think restoration means tearing out the original timber and bolting in something from a catalog. I've been looking for 2 years for someone who actually understands old buildings, who can train a crew, who knows the difference between fixing a thing and replacing it." She tapped the folder. "That's a 3-year contract to lead heritage restoration across the entire portfolio. It comes with a signing retainer substantial enough to make a certain bank letter disappear by Friday." Daniel stared at it. His pride rose up in him, hard and immediate. "Margaret, I can't take a handout. I won't." "It is not a handout," she said firmly, stepping closer until there was no distance left to hide in. "I do not make sentimental investments. Ask Gerald how sentimental I am. I watched you diagnose a dead engine by sound in a snowstorm with a multi-tool and a piece of wire. I watched you take apart the most insufferable man on my board with a sentence about a wristwatch. You are the best at what you do, and I have spent 2 years and a great deal of money on people who were the worst. This is the smartest acquisition I'll make all year." She paused, and the executive fell away, and what was left was just the woman from the booth. "Also," she said, quieter, "I wanted a reason to see you again, and I knew you'd never let me buy you dinner at the old mill." A slow smile broke across Daniel's face, banishing the gray weight that had sat on him all morning. He looked down at the folder and at her hand resting on the worn wood of the bench beside it, and at the impossible distance between their two worlds suddenly looking like nothing at all. "You're right," he said, stepping in close enough to catch the cold and pine smell of her. "I hate that restaurant. But I know a diner that makes a genuinely terrible cup of coffee, if you're interested." "It's a date," Margaret said, and she leaned in, and their lips met at last in the sawdust light of the barn, surrounded by half-mended things and the soft humming of a little girl gluing wings on straight so the whole thing wouldn't crash. And it occurred to Daniel, somewhere in the middle of it, that the best things in his life had never once arrived new and perfect off a showroom floor. They were the things found broken down in the dark, on the worst night of the year, the things a person took the time to understand, and the things that two people, against every sensible expectation, decided to rebuild together, one careful piece at a time. I've thought a lot about the small choice Daniel made that night, easing his foot off the gas instead of driving past a half-buried hazard light on Highway 11. He was already cold, already late, already broke down to his last $40, and nobody on earth would have blamed him for keeping going. But he stopped. And everything good that came after, the contract the barn saved, the woman who turned out to be the one person he'd been dreading, all of it grew out of that one decision to do the decent thing when it cost him something. That's the part I keep returning to. We like to imagine our lives are changed by giant moments, but mostly they turn on whether we're willing to be good when it's inconvenient. What strikes me about Daniel isn't just that he was kind, it's that he was capable. He could read a dead engine by ear in a snowstorm and take apart a smug man like Gerald with a single quiet observation about a wristwatch, because he had spent years actually paying attention to how things work and how people work. Kindness without skill is just good intentions, and good intentions don't get a stranded woman home through a Muskoka blizzard. He had bothered to learn things deeply in a world that rewards looking impressive over being useful. When the moment came, he didn't need to perform. He just knew. And that quiet competence is what let his goodness actually accomplish something. And then there's the harder thing, the thing Margaret saw in him before she even knew his name. Daniel had lost his wife, missed 2 years of his daughter's life, and watched the bank close in on everything his father built. And he didn't go bitter, and he didn't quit. He took over a cold barn and kept showing up for Chloe and refused, even when the letter on the workbench said he should give up, to throw away what was worth saving. That kind of steadiness under weight isn't loud. It looks like a man gluing a model airplane's wings on straight at the end of a brutal day so the whole thing won't crash. If there's anything I want to carry out of their story, it's that the 3 things worth building in yourself are the willingness to do right when it's costly, the patience to genuinely learn your craft, and the stubbornness to keep mending what's broken instead of walking away. Margaret didn't fall for Daniel's money because he had none. She fell for the rare combination of a good man who was also a capable one who also refused to quit. Those qualities don't arrive new and perfect off a showroom floor. You assemble them slowly on the worst nights, one careful piece at a time, and then one day you look up and realize you've become the kind of person who stops on the highway.